Look at that one, Dale. A car like that out here, this late on a Tuesday. Sergeant Derek Pruitt said it the way a man announces a meal he's already decided to eat. Not a question, not a suspicion. Just the flat certainty of someone who had already run the calculation and arrived at his answer before the other car had even passed the overpass. And the answer was the same answer. It always was on Tuesday nights and Friday nights on this stretch of I-95 through Oak Hollow County, where the highway cut through a thin strip of nowhere between two cities, large enough to have real oversight and real journalists and real people who asked questions, and Oak Hollow was none of those things. Officer Dale Wyrick glanced up from his phone, saw the black Lincoln Navigator gliding south through the rain, saw the driver through the untinted window, a large black man, broad-shouldered. Something about the way he sat, and Wyrick felt the familiar low-grade excitement that he had learned to call professional instinct, even though it had nothing to do with any crime he had ever witnessed and everything to do with a calculation as simple and ugly as the one Pruitt had just run out loud. The patrol car sat in the shadow beneath the County Road 7 overpass engine, idling lights off and visible from the highway until Pruitt decided it wasn't anymore. And this was where they sat every Tuesday and every Friday between 9 at night and 2 in the morning. Not because the department had assigned them here, not because there was a pattern of crime on this particular mile of asphalt, but because this particular mile of asphalt ran through a dead zone between two jurisdictions where radio traffic was thin and dispatch response was slow, and the kind of people who drove through here late at night were often the kind of people who couldn't afford to fight back. Pruitt had been running this stretch for 6 years, and in 6 years he had never received a formal complaint that went anywhere, had never been called before. A review board had in fact received a commendation 2 years ago for high-value asset recovery, which was the phrase the department used for the $340,000 in seized property that had moved through Fletcher's towing and auction in the same calendar year, and the commendation hung in a frame in the break room between a fire safety notice and a calendar from a local insurance company. Pruitt opened the small center console between the seats, looked at the contents, and closed it again. A gesture as automatic and unremarkable as checking a coat pocket for keys. Something his hands did without instruction from his brain. And Wyrick had seen him do it 100 times, and had never asked what was inside, because some things in this particular patrol car you did not ask about, and both of them understood that without it ever being said. The rain tapped steadily on the roof of the cruiser, and the Lincoln's taillights shrank in the distance, and Pruitt put the car in drive. The man behind the wheel of the Lincoln Navigator had been driving since Richmond, where a meeting with 3 federal attorneys had run 40 minutes past its scheduled end, because the discussion had turned, as these discussions always did, eventually into something that required precision and patience, rather than efficiency. And precision and patience were 2 things that Calvin Okafor had never been willing to trade away for convenience, not in 31 years of law enforcement, not once. He was 53 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches tall, with the kind of build that had once made him useful in field situations, and now simply made him visible in rooms where people preferred invisibility, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and a face that had been described by subordinates in the affectionate shorthand of people who both feared and respected him as a face that had heard every lie at least twice, and forgotten none of them. He wore a charcoal vest over a white dress shirt, his jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat where his overnight bag sat, and he was driving at 53 miles per hour in a 55 zone, because he was not in a hurry, and because driving correctly on an empty highway at night was one of the small disciplines he had maintained since the age of 22, when a training officer in Baltimore had told him that the best way to stay out of trouble was to give trouble nothing to hold on to. He noticed the patrol car before it pulled out from under the overpass, because he had been noticing parked cars in shadows for 30 years, and he noted the position, noted the timing, noted the fact that the lights came on only after he had passed, and he felt something settle into place in his chest. Not dread, not anger, but the quiet and particular alertness of a man who recognizes a familiar shape in the dark. He signaled right before the shoulder even came into view, a reflex that had nothing to do with compliance, and everything to do with the fact that he had learned long ago that when you are a large black man driving an expensive car on a quiet road at 11 at night, you give them absolutely nothing, not one single frame of footage that could be described as anything other than textbook correct. And so his hands went to 10 and 2 on the wheel, and the window came down, and the interior light came on, and all of this was done before Pruitt's door had even opened. Before he cut the engine, his right hand moved briefly to the door panel, a check quick and practiced of the small compartment there, and then settled back onto the wheel, and anyone watching would have seen only a man making himself comfortable before a routine stop, which was not what it was at all. He waited. In the side mirror, he could see two figures approach the way they split, the way the younger one hung back near the bumper with his hand resting on his holster, the way the older one walked forward with the flashlight beam already sweeping the interior before he was within speaking distance. And Calvin Okafor watched all of this with the flat recording attention of a man who was not afraid and was not performing the absence of fear, but simply did not possess it in the quantity this situation was designed to produce. Wyrick shone the light directly into Calvin's eyes and kept it there, a technique that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with disorientation. And Calvin did not blink in a way that suggested discomfort, only turned his head a fraction to allow the light to land past the bridge of his nose, rather than directly on his pupils, a small adjustment that Wyrick registered as irritation without being able to say exactly why. License and registration. Wyrick said, flat and bored and hostile all at once, the tone of a man performing a transaction he considered beneath him, even as he was the one who had initiated it. Calvin said his license was in his jacket on the passenger seat and his registration was in the glove box, and that he was going to reach for them, now his voice carrying no apology and no aggression, only the clean, declarative tone of someone stating facts in the order they would occur. "Step out," Wyrick said. And when Calvin asked quietly whether there had been a traffic violation, Wyrick said he smelled alcohol, and the lie landed in the wet air between them, with the practiced ease of something he had said 300 times, and Calvin said he hadn't had a drink in 14 years. Just those 8 words. No argument, no outrage, just the fact placed gently on the table, and Wyrick said, "Get out of the car." Pruitt materialized at the rear quarter panel the way large men in uniforms materialize when they want you to feel surrounded rather than stopped, and he looked at the navigator the way a man looks at a house. He is already deciding how to enter his eyes, moving over the exterior with the practiced inventory of someone calculating value. And when Calvin stepped out and stood to his full height, Pruitt's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes reassessed, recalibrated, and then dismissed what it had found. "Nice ride," Pruitt said. Calvin said it was a rental, and Pruitt said who rented it for him, and his tone made the question not a question at all, but an accusation wrapped in the formality of syntax. And Calvin looked at him with an expression that contained no anger and no deference, only the steady cataloging attention of someone reading a document carefully, and he said he had rented it himself, Sergeant, and that his identification was in the jacket on the seat, and if they looked at it, they could resolve this without anyone making a mistake they could not take back. "Turn around," Pruitt said. Calvin turned around and Pruitt pressed him against the wet metal of the navigator, and the cuffs went on with a practiced quickness that spoke of repetition, and Calvin felt the cold steel click against his wrists and said without raising his voice, without turning his head in the tone of a man reading a final warning from a document that had already been notarized, "You are making a mistake that cannot be undone." Pruitt tightened the cuffs one extra click and said nothing, and the rain continued to fall. The Oak Hollow County Sheriff's Substation had been built in 1974 from a design that prioritized permanence over functionality, all heavy brick and narrow windows and fluorescent light fixtures that buzzed at a frequency that seemed calibrated to produce headaches rather than illuminate anything. And it smelled of floor wax and old coffee, and the particular institutional despair of a building where hope had stopped visiting some years ago, and nobody had bothered to notice. Pruitt brought Calvin in through the back entrance rather than the side door that was 30 feet closer to the processing desk, and this choice was not about security or procedure, but about the long corridor that ran from the back entrance through the center of the bullpen, past 3 desks and a row of filing cabinets and the break room doorway where the shift supervisor usually sat, and Pruitt walked Calvin down this corridor the way a man walks a trophy through a room full of people he wants to impress. "Look what I pulled off 95, Pruitt said to the room, and there was laughter, not the surprised laughter of people encountering something unexpected, but the easy rolling laughter of people who had heard the opening line of this particular joke many times before and knew the punchline and found it no less satisfying for the familiarity. 3 officers looked up from their desks, and one of them, a broad man with a neck like a truck axle, said something about checking for a cape, and another laughed, and none of them looked at Calvin with anything that could be called direct hostility, because direct hostility required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was not what this was. This was the practiced invisibility of people who had learned to look at a certain category of human being as a unit of process rather than a person. The booking desk was staffed by Officer Darlene Hess, a heavy-set woman in her late 40s who wore her hair in a tight bun and chewed gum with the concentration of someone performing a task that required her full attention, and she did not look up when Pruitt stopped at her desk. "Drunk," she said to Pruitt, not to Calvin. "Refused the breathalyzer," Wyrick said from behind Calvin's left shoulder, and this was the second lie of the evening, clean and automatic, offered before Hess had even framed the question properly, and Darlene Hess typed something into her computer and said, "Name," and Calvin said his full name clearly and slowly, and Hess typed John Doe and said the system was down for maintenance and they'd run his ID when it came back up. Then Pruitt lifted Calvin's jacket from where it had been tucked under his arm since the navigator set it on the desk and began going through the pockets with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to explain this action to anyone, and he found the wallet and opened it and found the money. First $220 in bills and counted it with his thumb the way a man counts his own money, and then he found the badge case. He opened it. The room did not change its sound immediately, but something shifted in the quality of Pruitt's stillness, a fraction of a second in which his thumb stopped moving, and his eyes moved from the credentials to Calvin and back, a recalibration that lasted just long enough to be visible and just short enough to be deniable. And then he laughed a sound that was loud enough to carry across the bullpen and said, "Fake." And a bad one at that, says he's the director of the whole damn FBI, and tossed the wallet onto Hess's desk. The bills, all $220, went into Pruitt's left breast pocket. Not the evidence tray, not the personal property envelope on the corner of Hess's desk, just his pocket. A movement as casual and unremarkable as a man picking up his change after buying a coffee, and nobody at the desk said a word about it. And nobody would have said a word about it because nobody ever said a word about it. And this was Tuesday, and Tuesday was a good night. Calvin watched the wallet land on the desk and watched the money disappear into Pruitt's pocket, and his face did not change, and his breathing did not change, but his eyes moved to the badge number on Wyrick's chest, to the vehicle number stenciled on the key ring hanging from Hess's drawer, to the position of the single security camera mounted above the break room door at an angle that would capture the front desk, but not the area where Pruitt was now standing. And he filed each of these things in an internal register that was organized and precise and had been accumulating information since the moment the patrol car's lights appeared in his mirror. The room was 8 feet by 6 feet with white ceramic tile on every surface, including the ceiling, a single fluorescent tube in a wire cage overhead, and a drain in the center of the floor that had not been cleaned recently enough to discuss. And it was cold in the way that institutional spaces are cold when the coldness is not accidental but architectural, designed into the temperature and the hardness and the light to make you feel that you are somewhere outside of ordinary human consideration. Pruitt ran the search, and Wyrick stood near the door and talked during it. The commentary low and continuous, the specific words less important than their purpose, which was to make a man feel small by making him invisible by referring to his body as a category rather than a person, by punctuating every procedural action with something that was not quite a threat and not quite a joke, but existed in the space between them where cruelty lives most comfortably. Calvin counted the cracks in the east wall tile 17, ranging from hairline fractures near the baseboard to a diagonal split above the light switch that had been there long enough to collect dust along its edges, and he noted that the security camera in the upper right corner of the room was positioned at an angle that left a dead zone along the near wall, the wall where Pruitt was standing. A dead zone that was either an oversight of installation or a feature of design. And he noted this because it was the kind of detail that becomes relevant in a federal indictment when the defense argues that behavior was not concealed. Wyrick said at one point, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, "Nobody's coming for you, man. Nobody even knows you're here." Calvin heard this the way he heard everything in the room, not as information, not as threat, but as evidence, another item for the register, notable less for its content than for what it revealed about the architecture of this particular operation. The confidence of men who had run the same play so many times in the same dead zone, between jurisdictions that they had stopped imagining that anyone was watching. They gave him a jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too small, the orange fabric riding up his calves and pulling across his shoulders, and Calvin put it on without comment, and when he was dressed, he folded the extra fabric at the waist into a neat tuck. One deliberate, precise adjustment, in a room that had been designed to strip away every act of self-determination, and the smallness of the gesture was its power, the way it said without words that the quality of the clothes they provided was a reflection of them, and not of him. The holding cell was a concrete rectangle containing a steel toilet, a wooden bench that had been bolted to the wall at some point in the 1980s and not cleaned thoroughly since, and 3 men who looked at Calvin the way people look at anyone new in a confined space, with the practiced low-energy assessment of people who have learned to read newcomers quickly and without sentiment. The first was a young man, maybe 19, curled in the far corner with his knees drawn up and his arms wrapped around them, shaking with the fine, persistent tremor of someone whose body was trying to renegotiate a chemical agreement that had been running for too long. The second was an older man in a work shirt with a construction company logo on the chest, sitting against the wall with his eyes on the ceiling, jaw working slowly, gone somewhere inside himself that the concrete walls couldn't reach. The third was Darnell Webb. Darnell was 34 years old with a spider web tattoo on the left side of his neck and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to conserve energy in environments where energy can be taxed without warning. And he watched Calvin sit down on the edge of the bench and smooth the orange fabric of the too small jumpsuit and said nothing for the better part of a minute before he said with the flat directness of a man who no longer found anything surprising, "FBI director, huh? They do that one about once a month. Usually a councilman or a deacon." Calvin looked at him. "How many times have they brought you in?" "3, Darnell said. "This is number 3. Pruitt planted a baggie on me Friday. Same baggie, different Friday, 3rd time in 14 months. By the time I make bail, the job's gone. By the time the case gets dismissed, the next job's gone too. That's the math." He said it without bitterness, which was worse than bitterness would have been the way a man describes the weather in a place he has accepted he cannot leave. Calvin listened to all of it, the whole story, the first time and the second time, and now this. And when Darnell was done, Calvin sat quietly for a moment and then said low enough that only Darnell could hear, "How many others?" Darnell looked at him. "On this block I know of 6. In this county more than I can count." Calvin nodded once. "Not a 4th time," he said, and Darnell looked at him for a long moment, studying the man in the too small jumpsuit sitting straight-backed on a prison bench with the composure of someone waiting for a meeting to begin, and Darnell Webb, who had stopped believing in things some years ago, found that he was not entirely sure what he was looking at. Roy Tesler came on shift at 3 in the morning, the way he had come on shift at 3 in the morning for 11 years quietly with a thermos of bad coffee and the slightly defeated air of a man who had long ago made his peace with the fact that the career he had imagined at 22 and the career he actually had were not the same thing, and probably never would be. He was 41 years old, 12 years in the department, the kind of officer who filed his paperwork correctly and showed up on time and did not plant evidence or steal money or trade favors with towing companies, not because the opportunity had never presented itself, but because he had a specific and inconvenient inability to look at the people in the cells as anything other than people, and this quality had not made him popular with Pruitt's crew, and had not gotten him promoted, and had in fact earned him the particular kind of departmental isolation that accumulates when you are reliably present and reliably unhelpful to the things that your colleagues consider important. He walked the cells at 3:15, as he always did, and stopped at cell 4 because the man on the bench was sitting up straight and awake with his eyes open, which was unusual, and because there was something about the quality of the man's attention, the way he turned his head when Tesler's footsteps were still 20 feet away, that registered in Tesler's peripheral awareness as something that did not belong in this particular cell. Calvin said he had a blood pressure condition and that his medication was in his wallet, which had been confiscated by Sergeant Pruitt and not logged into the property system, and he asked whether Officer Tesler would mind checking. Tesler sighed. He said if there were no pills, he was sending him to solitary. Calvin said he understood. Tesler was gone for 11 minutes. For 11 shanty. When he came back, he was walking faster than he had been walking before, and he was holding the badge case the way a man holds a live wire carefully with his fingertips at a slight distance from his body. And he stopped at the bars and looked at Calvin and looked at the badge case and looked at Calvin again, and his face had the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting a closet and found a hallway leading somewhere he did not have a map for. He stood there for 4 seconds without speaking. "Good morning, Officer Tesler," Calvin said pleasantly. Tesler said quietly that this was real, that the holographic seal on the credentials was the new series, that he had seen the memo about the new series 3 months ago. Calvin said yes, and that Tesler already knew what the penalties were for what had happened in this building tonight, and that what Tesler did in the next 5 minutes would determine which side of those penalties he was standing on. 3 things Calvin said. Open the gate. Give him access to a phone. Tell no one, not Pruitt, not Wyrick, not Hess, until Calvin said otherwise. And one more thing. A 4th thing, which was that after the call was made, Tesler would lock the gate again. Tesler's eyebrows moved. "You want to go back in?" "The crime isn't finished yet," Calvin said. "And neither is the evidence." The booking desk was empty, and the bullpen was quiet, and the fluorescent lights buzzed their headache frequency buzz over a room full of empty chairs and half-eaten paperwork, and Calvin stood at the desk and dialed a number from memory. 11 digits, a line that rang in the Strategic Information and Operations Center at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., at a console that was staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by people whose entire job was to not be surprised by anything. They were slightly surprised. "This is Director Okafor," Calvin said. "Authorization Delta 7 Foxtrot King. I am currently in holding at the Oak Hollow County Substation off I-95 South. I need you to listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once." He gave them 5 things in order: the substation address, the patrol car number, the names Pruitt and Wyrick, a request to run financial records on a towing company called Fletcher's, and cross-reference with the county property seizure logs for the past 3 years, and a specific time 0800, before which no federal personnel were to appear at either the substation or the county courthouse. The person on the other end asked about his physical status. "Functional," Calvin said. They asked about the timeline. "I want arraignment," Calvin said. "I want to be called John Doe in front of a court reporter. I want the judge to say it into the microphone. I want every piece of this on the official record before anyone walks through that door." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds, which was a long silence for that particular line in that particular building. "Understood, sir." 800 hours, Calvin said. Not a minute sooner. He hung up and handed the phone back to Tesler, who had been standing 6 feet away with the expression of a man watching a controlled detonation from what he hoped was a safe distance. Calvin walked back to the cell. Tesler's hands were not entirely steady as he worked the key into the lock, and the gate swung open and then swung closed again with a clang that echoed down the concrete corridor. And Tesler stood alone at the far end of the hall with a badge case in his hand and a decision in his chest that had already been made, even though he hadn't finished making it yet. In cell 4, Darnell Webb was awake, sitting up watching Calvin settle back onto the bench and close his eyes with the unhurried ease of a man who has finished what he came to do. And the air in the room had changed in some quality that Darnell could not have named, but felt clearly the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm that hasn't arrived yet but is already decided. Darnell did not ask what had just happened. He lay back down and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep, and neither did the man on the other bench, but for entirely different reasons. Pruitt came in at 7, looking like a man who had slept well and eaten breakfast and had no reason to expect the day to be anything other than a repetition of all the days that had preceded it, which was the specific quality of confidence that belongs to people who have gone long enough without consequence that they have stopped factoring consequence into their planning. He rattled the cell door open himself, coffee in hand, and called for John Doe and 3 other names, and Calvin stood and put his hands forward for the restraints without being asked, and Pruitt secured the cuffs with one extra click, the way he had the night before, and looked at Calvin with the satisfied expression of a man who has established to his own satisfaction the correct hierarchy of a relationship. "Good luck in there," Director Pruitt said, and laughed at his own joke, and Wyrick laughed with him from the doorway, and the sound followed them down the corridor and into the parking lot where the transport van idled in the gray morning. The 4 of them. Calvin Darnell, the young man from the corner, and the man in the work shirt were loaded into the van and secured to the restraint bar along the inside wall with the practiced efficiency of people being processed through a system that had handled so many of them that the individual specifics no longer registered as requiring attention. The van pulled out of the substation parking lot and into the streets of Oak Hollow, and Calvin looked out through the mesh-covered window at the town passing by a hardware store, with its gate still down an elementary school, with a hand-painted banner above the entrance that read, "Every student belongs here." A bus shelter with the glass cracked and a woman standing inside it with a grocery bag waiting. And he looked at all of it with a steady, patient attention, not cataloging this time, but simply observing the way a doctor looks at a patient before beginning treatment, taking inventory, not of what can be extracted, but of what needs to be healed. Darnell sat next to him and said nothing, which was the right thing, and the van rode the rest of the way in a silence that had weight to it. The Oak Hollow County Courthouse had been built in the same era as the substation, and from the same philosophy, which was that justice was best administered in spaces that communicated its weight through their heaviness, and the main courtroom achieved this through water-stained drop ceilings, wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people sitting in them trying to look smaller than they felt, and a bench that was elevated 3 feet above the floor in a way that was meant to communicate authority but mostly communicated that whoever sat behind it needed the height. Judge Howard Bledsoe sat behind it like a man who had occupied that position for so long that the chair had conformed to him rather than the other way around his face. The particular red of a man who has spent years being deferred to his gavel already in his hand, before the first case was called a habit, so ingrained it had become involuntary like breathing. The room was full of the usual Tuesday morning population people who had been in holding over the weekend. A few who had been their longer family members in the gallery with the tight-faced determination of people who had taken time off work to be here and could not afford the time off work. A public defender working from a stack of files that towered above the table in a way that communicated the volume of cases through its architecture more effectively than any statistic could. Darlene Hess Bledsoe's sister had submitted the booking paperwork. The name on it read John Doe. Case 4471 was called. Calvin was led to the podium, hands cuffed in front of him, the orange jumpsuit still 2 sizes too small, and Pruitt and Wyrick materialized at the back wall with the ease of men who had seen this particular show enough times to know exactly when the good part was coming. Bledsoe said, "Mr. Doe, you are charged with obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and driving under the influence." "How do you plead?" Calvin leaned forward to the microphone, the chain of his handcuffs resting against the wood of the podium, and said, "My name is Calvin Okafor, and I plead not guilty." Bledsoe said to stop wasting the court's time, and the prosecutor said the officer's report stated the defendant had refused to identify and presented fraudulent federal credentials, And Calvin said simply, with the register of a man who has already seen the last page of a story that everyone else in the room is still reading. The first chapter of Check the Docket, Your Honor, or The Window. The rumble began so low that people felt it in their feet before they heard it in the air. Not thunder too steady for thunder. The deep, sustained vibration of large engines, many of them moving in formation, and Pruitt turned his head toward the back window and his face changed. The way a face changes when the ground shifts beneath it. The careful, practiced confidence dissolving into something that had no name yet, but was beginning to have a shape. The back doors of the courtroom opened. They came in without theatrics, which was worse than theatrics would have been 6 agents in tactical vests with FBI in block yellow letters across the chest spreading into the room with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who had planned this particular entry and were executing the plan rather than improvising it, taking positions at the 2 side doors and the main entrance and the jury box doorway before anyone in the courtroom had fully processed that they were inside. Behind them walked Special Agent in Charge Amara Osei, who was 44 years old and had spent the last 8 months building the case that had put her in this room at this moment. And she walked the center aisle of the Oak Hollow County Courthouse, the way a person walks toward something they have been moving toward for a very long time without hurry and without hesitation. She looked at Bledsoe and said, "This man is not a defendant. Remove his restraints, now." The bailiff looked at Bledsoe, and Bledsoe opened his mouth and nothing came out of it for a moment. That was long enough to be significant. Long enough for the entire room to understand that the man behind the elevated bench had lost the thing that made the bench mean something. And then the bailiff walked to the podium and his hands were trembling visibly as he found the key, and the cuffs came off and fell against the wood with a sound that rang out in the silence like a clock stopping. Calvin rubbed his wrists. He turned slowly, unhurried, and looked at the room behind him at the gallery where a woman in the second row had both hands pressed over her mouth at the public defender who had set down her tower of files and was staring with an expression that had passed through disbelief and arrived somewhere on the other side of it at the prosecutor who was looking at her own hands as though she was seeing them for the first time and not liking what she saw. He looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was standing against the back wall where he had positioned himself to watch, and his coffee cup was still in his hand, and his face had performed a comprehensive reorganization. In the past 45 seconds, the architecture of certainty that had been built up over 23 years of consequence-free mornings having encountered for the first time the full weight of what it had been resting on. Osei said, "The man standing before this court is Director Calvin Okafor, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, currently conducting a field review of civil rights compliance in this jurisdiction under federal investigative authority. This court has been under federal financial scrutiny for 8 months. Arrest warrants for Judge Howard Bledsoe, Sergeant Derek Pruitt, Officer Dale Wyrick, and the owner of Fletcher's Towing and Auction were signed by a federal magistrate at 6 o'clock this morning." Bledsoe said, "This is my courtroom," in the voice of a man saying it to remind himself rather than anyone else, and 2 agents stepped alongside him, and his gavel was still in his hand, and then it was not, and the sound of it being placed on the bench by a federal agent was the quietest and most conclusive sound the room had ever produced. A pen rolled off the prosecutor's table and nobody picked it up. Calvin walked toward the exit and did not look back at the room because the room had already shown him everything it had to show. The convoy returned to the substation, and the substation was a different place from what it had been at 11 the night before. Not physically different, the same brick and fluorescent buzz and floor wax smell, but different. The way a stage is different after the performance when the lights are up and the audience is gone and the props are just props and agents moved through every room with banker boxes and evidence labels and the particular focused silence of people who are building something case by case, document by document from the materials that other people thought were safe. The uniformed officers of the Oak Hollow County substation stood in clusters near the walls with their weapons secured and their faces arranged in the expressions of people who are attempting to calculate at speed what they knew and when they knew it, and whether the distance between that knowledge and this moment constitutes a defensible position. Roy Tesler sat alone at a small metal desk at the end of the back corridor, isolated from his colleagues by 12 feet of physical space and a decision he had made at 3 a.m. that had already traveled further than he could have imagined when he made it, and he was looking into a cup of coffee that had gone cold. And when he heard the footsteps, he looked up. Calvin crossed the floor to Tesler's desk and sat down in the chair across from him, without being asked, and without preamble. "They're going to hate me for a long time," Tesler said, not complaining, just observing the way a man notes weather. "Yes," Calvin said. "This department is being dissolved. The county is transferring jurisdiction to the state sheriff's office by end of month." Tesler looked at the agents moving through the room. "So there's nothing left to hate me in." "There's always something left to hate you in," Calvin said. "What there won't be is anything worth staying for." He set a card on the table, heavy cream stock with the Department of Justice seal pressed into it in gold, a phone number written on the back in ink that was clearly not printed. He said the Bureau needed people who understood corruption from the inside, who knew what it felt like to be the person in the room who saw the thing clearly, and still had to make a choice about it, and that those people were harder to find than people assumed. "Call Monday," Calvin said. "Internal Affairs Division. They have a position." Tesler picked up the card and held it in both hands, looking at the seal, and said nothing. Calvin stood, looked out at the room one final time, and said in a voice that carried evenly to every corner, every dollar, every text, every lie. Then he walked out. Brenda Colts was 47 years old and had been a registered nurse for 19 years when Wyrick pulled her over at 2 a.m. on the way home from a double shift at Mercy General. Her scrubs still on her badge, still clipped to her collar and filed a DU. I report that contained no breathalyzer result because no breathalyzer had been offered, only a charge and a number and 48 hours in a holding cell that cost her the job because Mercy General did not hold positions for employees who went absent without notification and could not be reached by phone. She had been fighting the charge through a legal aid attorney for 14 months. When the news about Oak Hollow broke across her phone in a notification while she was making breakfast, and she read the headline standing in her kitchen in yesterday's clothes, and she did not cry, and she did not feel the particular relief she had imagined she would feel during the months she had spent rehearsing this moment, and she called her daughter and said, "They finally looked," and the 3 words were enough. Marcus Beale had been 22 and 3 weeks into his senior year on a partial academic scholarship when Pruitt's traffic stop produced a possession charge that was false and a booking record that was real, and the scholarship committee did not distinguish between pending and convicted, only between record and no record. And by the time the charge was eventually dropped 11 months later, the scholarship was gone, and the semester was gone, and the apartment near campus was gone, and Marcus was back in his mother's house working warehouse overnight shifts to cover what financial aid could no longer cover. He was on a forklift in Bay 7 of a distribution center when the news came through on his phone in a text from his old roommate. "They got them all. Man, Oak Hollow. It's all over the news." And he stopped the forklift in the middle of the bay and sat there in the low industrial dark for 15 minutes without moving. Not because he was overcome, but because he needed to sit with the fact that the thing he had stopped believing in had been true the whole time and had simply needed someone with the power to see it. In Cell 4 of the Oak Hollow substation at 11:47 in the morning, an agent in a Navy windbreaker unlocked the gate and told Darnell Webb he was free to go. All charges dropped, and Darnell stood up and looked at the open gate and did not move for 10 seconds, which is not a long time unless you are standing in a place you have been in twice before and the door has never opened like this. He walked out into the corridor and looked both ways, and there was no sign of the man in the too small jumpsuit, no sign of anyone he recognized, only the agent pointing him toward the exit and the daylight at the end of the hall, and Darnell walked toward it, and the word that was closest to what he felt was not joy and not relief, but something older and simpler than either of those, the feeling of a debt being paid that you had stopped expecting anyone to honor. The interrogation room at the Norfolk field office was everything the Oak Hollow substation was not soundproofed. Climate-controlled, the air carrying no smell of fear or floor wax, only recycled air and the faint, sterile coldness of a room that had been engineered to be neutral, so that everything brought into it stood out in high relief, and Pruitt had been sitting alone in it for an hour and 32 minutes, which was the specific duration that Osei's team had found through experience was enough time for the particular kind of man who believed himself in control to begin losing that belief without anyone having to say a word. The door opened and Calvin walked in, wearing a navy suit and a white shirt and a silk tie in a color between burgundy and brown, and on his lapel the small gold seal of the FBI, and he crossed to the corner of the room and leaned against the wall with his arms folded and said nothing. Osei sat across from Pruitt and read him his rights, and Pruitt said he wanted his union rep, and Calvin said from the corner, without looking up from the file in his hands, that the union rep was currently answering questions in a separate room about an interesting pattern in the pension fund deposits that tracked unusually closely with the Fletcher's towing auction schedule. Pruitt said this was entrapment. Calvin opened the file and placed a photograph on the table, a still from the dash cam of Pruitt's own patrol car, clear and color accurate, showing Pruitt's hand withdrawing $220 from a wallet that was not his, and placing it in a breast pocket, and said that entrapment required coercion toward a crime the subject would not otherwise have committed, and asked whether someone had forced Pruitt to pull over a vehicle traveling at 53 miles per hour, in a 55 zone with no traffic violation, and asked whether someone had forced him to remove the money, and then placed 4 more photographs on the table, each from a different date, each showing the same motion from the same angle. 8 months, Calvin said quietly. You were very consistent. Pruitt looked at the photographs and then at the wall, and his face was doing the work of a man who is assembling a counter-argument from materials that have already been disqualified and knows it but has not finished knowing it yet. And he said the serial number thing was a setup that anyone could have recorded serial numbers. And Osei said the bills had been processed through the FBI property office and logged under a federal case number before Calvin left Washington, and that the chain of custody was 14 months long and had no gaps. The first silence after that was real. Then Pruitt said Wyrick had been the one who suggested the John Doe procedure, that it was Wyrick's idea to keep the ID system offline, and Calvin set a single sheet of paper on the table, a printed transcript 3 pages time-stamped with a case number in the upper right corner, and said Wyrick had been talking since 9 that morning and that his account was already on the record. The second silence was longer. Then Pruitt said he could give them names, 3 names. People higher in the county structure who had known about the Fletcher arrangement, who had actively benefited from it, who had told Pruitt to keep the operation quiet when the first complaint surfaced 18 months ago. And as he said this, his voice was taking on the texture of a man making an offer he hopes will be enough. The desperation in it audible beneath the surface like water running under ice. Calvin set 1 more document on the table, a bank statement, a single page with 3 figures circled in red, and said they already had all 3 names along with their financial records, and that each of them had provided accounts of their own that referenced Pruitt specifically, and that the question now was not what Pruitt knew, but whether what he said matched what everyone else had already said, which would be the determining factor in what the federal prosecutor put in the sentencing recommendation. Pruitt looked at the bank statement. He looked at the photographs. He looked at Calvin, who was still leaning against the wall in the corner of the room with his arms folded, and Calvin looked back at him without expression, without satisfaction, without anything that could be called triumph. Just the steady and complete attention of a man for whom this moment was not a victory, but a conclusion, the end of a calculation that had been running since the sound of a patrol car's door closing in the rain on a Tuesday night on I-95. Pruitt's shoulders came down an inch. "How long were you watching?" he said. 8 months, Calvin said. "And I pulled you over on month 8. "You did." A long quiet. The air in the room moved through its circuits. "Start talking," Calvin said. "Every name, every number. 1 lie and the prosecutor goes to the full count. You know what the full count looks like." He walked to the door and opened it and did not look back, and behind him, Pruitt was already talking before the door closed. The federal courthouse in Richmond was full in the way that places are full when people have come, not because they are required to be there, but because they need to see something with their own eyes. And the gallery held the full spectrum of Oak Hollow's injured Brenda Colts in the third row in clean scrubs, with her daughter beside her. Marcus Beale in a new jacket near the aisle, community. Members who had driven 40 miles in cars that needed new brakes. Retired teachers and young parents, and an elderly man in the back row who had attended every single hearing in the 6 months since the arrest and had never once been quoted by any reporter. Calvin sat in the last row, suit gray and unremarkable, positioned against the side wall where the pillar half concealed him from the front of the room, and he was there, not because his presence served any procedural function. His testimony had been delivered months ago, but because he felt that certain things ought to be witnessed by the people who set them in motion, that there was a specific and non-negotiable obligation to be in the room when the last piece of the thing you built was placed. The federal judge was a woman in her early 60s with the reputation for treating public corruption cases as the most serious category of offense she encountered, which was a position she arrived at through the logic that a private citizen who steals breaks a law, but a public official who steals breaks the law, and the idea of the law simultaneously, and the sentence should reflect both. She read the verdicts in the order in which the conspiracy had been structured. Bledsoe first because he had been the ceiling that kept everything below it in place. 28 years. Bledsoe sat down like a man whose legs had decided independently of the rest of him that there was no longer a reason to perform their function, and 2 marshals stepped in smoothly to prevent the collapse from becoming a scene, and someone in the gallery exhaled in a way that was not quite a sound, and not quite silence. Pruitt received 22 years, and he stood for it without his legs failing, which was a form of dignity that required noticing even in the context of everything else. And he had nothing on his face except the expression of a man who has finished arguing and is now in the country beyond argument, where there is only the long flat fact of what happened and what follows from it. Wyrick received 8 years reduced for cooperation, and he cried quietly into his hands while the number was read the way a young man cries when he finally understands that youth is not a permanent exemption from consequence. When the marshals walked Pruitt past the gallery toward the side door, he and Calvin were in each other's sight lines for approximately 4 seconds, neither of them having arranged it. The geometry of the room simply producing the alignment. And Calvin did not nod, and did not look away. And his expression contained nothing that could be described as victory or satisfaction, only the settled, complete attention of a man who has watched a ledger close, who has seen the final entry made, and is ready now to close the book. The door closed behind Pruitt. Osei sat down in the seat beside Calvin and said, Fletcher had signed a full cooperation agreement that morning, and that the civil suits from 17 identified victims were proceeding on an accelerated schedule, and that the county had formally petitioned the state for a new judicial appointment to replace Bledsoe. Calvin received all of this without moving. The Lincoln, he said finally. Already back at the rental agency, Osei said. Fletcher had it listed for auction. Last piece of evidence we needed for the RICO seizure. His lot, his trucks, all of it. Calvin nodded. On the courthouse steps, Roy Tesler was waiting in a suit that was slightly too new. The way suits look on people who don't wear them often, but have made the effort, and when Calvin came through the doors, Tesler straightened without thinking about it, the way a person straightens when something they recognize as larger than themselves enters the space. They shook hands. Neither of them needed to say anything about why Tesler was there. The handshake said it the way some things only ever get said correctly without words. The Fletchers' towing lot sat on the south edge of Oak Hollow for one more day after the verdict, federal seizure notices laminated and staked to the chain-link fence at every entrance, and the owner stood at the window of his trailer office and looked at the rows of impounded cars. Other people's cars. Cars that had passed through his hands on their way to auctions that had no business happening. And then looked at the empty space near the front gate where the Lincoln Navigator had stood until the federal agents came to collect it. A clean rectangular absence in the oil-stained gravel, the precise outline of something that had been there long enough to leave a mark. And he stood there a long time looking at that outline without calling anyone because there was no one left to call. Brenda Colts got her nursing license reinstated on a Tuesday morning and went back to work at a different hospital the following Monday. And on her first shift, she introduced herself to a young patient in the overnight ward, a boy of 17 who had been brought in alone and was frightened and trying not to show it. And she sat with him until the fear subsided, which took 40 minutes. And she did not clock those 40 minutes separately from her shift, because caring for a frightened person in the dark was not a deviation from the work. It was the work, it had always been the work. And she had never forgotten that, even when everything else had been taken, and Darnell Webb texted his son 3 words that night from a city 2 hours away. "Dad's okay." And the son read the text in his bedroom and did not write back immediately because he needed to sit with the fact of it first. And when he finally wrote back, he wrote just, "Okay, good," with no punctuation, because he was 16 and did not yet have the language for what the message had meant to him, which was the same thing. It always means when the person you were afraid of losing turns out to still be there. The case became a standard curriculum module at 4 law schools the following academic year, and the professors who taught it did not focus on the charges or the sentences, but on a single question they put to their students. On the first day, there were 12 officers in that building who knew something was wrong, and 11 of them said nothing. So what do you say to the one who did? And what does your answer tell you about the kind of lawyer you are going to be? If this story moved you, please like and share it. Those small actions help us keep telling stories that matter on our channel. Subscribe so you never miss the next one, because justice deserves an audience.